All right, good morning, Camera. Zoom, we're still all right? Excellent. All right, I will say good morning, and welcome to another incredible day of Maseches Nazir. So we'll say beginning by thanking all of our sponsors, thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, to thank Mrs. Bracha Shimmer for dedicating all Shimmer and Drushos in memory of her husband, Avram ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi, Zichron Lebracha, and to thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating all Shimmer and Drushos this month in the Schus of our Shlema for Shulamis Bas Susha. The Neshama should have an Aliyah in the family in Nechama, and the Chola should have a refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. We'll say incredible. With that, let us begin. Today's daf is Yud Aleph 11, and we are picking up Emir Hashem on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph at the second Mishnah. We made a little bit of headway in the daf yesterday, so we're picking up again 11a, second Mishnah on the page. Harini Nazir. We'll say some really interesting cases over here. They're all interesting cases. Harini Nazir. Amanas she'ehei shose yayin. I can handle this one, right? As I say, I'm going to be a Nazir on the condition, Amanas means on the condition that I am going to drink wine, as well as become defiled, right? Become tamei to the dead. So he's undertaking that. Rabbi said, now understand. You'll say to yourself, so what are you doing? So remember again, in fairness, there are multiple pieces to Naziros. So this guy is saying, listen, I'm happy to take on the bulk of Naziros, but I'm going to drink wine. So I'm going to become a Nazir on the condition that I could drink wine, or on the condition that I could go ahead and go to a levaya, right? Go to a cemetery, become Tamei, Tumas, Meis. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Harei Nazir, Basar Bekulan. Ultimately, again, such a person will call him Ruvain. Ruvain is a Nazir, and in fact, again, he is usher to all of these things. So we'll say, so again, the Harini Nazir works, he is a Nazir, and again, he has all of the prohibitions associated with Naziros. Now, what's going on over here? The truth is, we've already learned this concept. If you take a look at the Rush, we'll say in the left hand margin, about halfway, you see where Tosis Dahavi Masna Masha Kasav Batara, that Tosis, literally right across in that Tosis in the Rush. So writes the Rush, Hariz and Nazir V'asar B'kulan, Rabbana L'tamayu D'amri La'el, Afilu Lo Nadar Ela Me'achat Sanim, Nazir Mikulan. Shabbos say, so the Rush is saying this is actually reflective of a view we already learned. Now, the view was phrased in the positive, not the negative. Remember, we had this, I think this was on Monday or Sunday. The Rabbanan said, a person says, Harini Nazir Minachar Sanim. I'm a Nazir from grape skins. So what's the halacha? So he's a full-fledged Nazir. So we'll say, so essentially, this is the same case, just phrased a little bit differently. In other words, if I say I am a Nazir on the condition that I'm going to drink wine, what am I also effectively saying? I'm a Nazir from grapes, right? I'm a Nazir from Tumas Meis. So I'm accepting individual pieces of Naziros. Well, that's fine. Once you do that, by definition, that triggers a Neder Naziros. So it's the same concept. Just beforehand, it was phrased in the positive. Here it's phrased, or I should say, beforehand, it was phrased in what you're taking on. Here it's phrased as what you're excluding. But it's the same concept, namely that once you take on one piece of Naziros, you have effectively taken on the entire neder. Incredible. So that's part one. I will say next. Yodani sheish naziros. So I'll say this is an interesting case. Let's say a guy comes along and says, I know that there's a neder naziros. However, aval ini yodea shan nazir asr beyayin. But I did not know that a nazir can't drink wine. Now, what's happening over here? Take a look now at Rashi. Take a look at Rashi. So Rashi says over here, Vim Amar Yodani Shen Nazir Asur B'Yayin Aval Savar Hayisi Kishezerti Min Hayayin Shiu Chachamim Matirinli Mipnei Sha'ani Yoch. I'm sorry, actually that's not that is not yet. Sorry. So I'll say that before we get to Rashi. So here's the case. Yodani Sheish Naziros. So a guy went ahead and took on a Neder Naziros, right? And what happens? It says to us afterwards that I know that there's Naziros. So when I took it on, I know what I was doing, except I didn't know that a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine. I just didn't know that piece of information. So what's halacha will say? Hareza Aser. Ultimately, again, the Rabbanan say Tanakama says that's a Nazirus. That's a Nazirus, right? This guy is a Nazirus, full-fledged Nazir. Rabbi Shimon says, ultimately, again, no, you're not a Nazir. Now, what's the pshat? Now look at Rashi, Rabbi Shimon Matir. The Rabbi Shimon Matir is right across from the beginning of our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon Matir, the holosh lo kiba alav elachatzi anazirus shelo haya yodea shanazir aser b'yayin harezem muter bekulon. Rabbi Shimon latamei damer eino aser achiyazim bekulon. I will say this is the previous machlok Rabbi Shimon the Rabbanon, right? Rabbi Shimon holds that halacha l'maisa you are not a nazir unless you go ahead and undertake all of the prohibitions, right? Also, this is machlok Rabbanon and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbanon say that even if you undertake one of the prohibitions, you are a full-fledged Nazir. Rabbi Shimon says, no, you're only a Nazir if you undertake all of the prohibitions. So now watch this case. Reuven comes along, he says, Reuven takes a Nazir Nazirus. Then he tells us, oh, now he reads the fine print, right? He realizes he's not allowed to drink wine. Reuven says, oh, I didn't know that. I had no idea that ultimately a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine. So Rabbi Shimon says, okay, you're not a Nazir. Rabbanan say you're a Nazir, because even though you didn't know you're not allowed to drink wine, you did take on the other pieces. Therefore, again, anyone who accepts a partial Nazir, it's as if you accepted the whole Nazirus. Rabbi Shimon says, no, you're not a Nazir until you accept all the prohibitions or all the obligations, and you did not accept one of them. Therefore, you are not a Nazir. Good, that's case 2. Case 3. Yodani Shanazir Asaviyayin. Well, listen to this. Case 3 is the guy who says, I knew all of the halachas. I know all of the halachas. We'll say, watch this. Aval Savra Hayisi, but I thought, Shechachamim Matirami. I thought that even though a Nazir is usher in wine, right, all the prohibitions, I thought for sure that I was going to get a heter. I thought I was going to get a heter. Now, in this case, heter means hatara, right? I thought I was going to get a heter. Why? Mipnei she'ein ani yochel lichios ela b'yayin. Everyone knows me. Everyone knows me, right? So they know I need my wine. So I was just sure, I got it. I understood. In other words, here, we'll say in this case, there's no lack of clarity. I knew what I was doing. I was becoming a Nazir. But I just figured that, look, he'll say, there's a heter for everything, right? It's a heter. Just depends who you ask. Right? So I figured that, you know what? I'm becoming a full-fledged Nazir, but I was going to get a heter to go ahead and drink wine because everyone knows, and also that's the interesting part, right? Everyone knows that I can't live without mipnei she'enan yocholachios elabiyayin. Oh, mipnei sheni kol rasmei. So Rabbi say, guy says, I undertook an Nazir Nazirus. I know that a Nazir is not permitted to come in contact with the dead, but it's my job. I'm a gravedigger, right? I'm a cemetery keeper, right? That's what I do. So I just figured that of course there would be a heter. But say, what's the halacha? Harei mutter. So interesting that in this case the Tanakama says that ultimately again, when we say harei mutter, what does that mean? It's not an Neder Naziros. It's not an Neder Naziros. Rabbi Shimon says, no, it is a Neder Nazir. So we'll say, so let's just frame this over here. So 3 different cases, right? Case number 1 is I'm becoming a Nazir on the condition that I get to drink wine. So we'll say, what's the halacha? You're a Nazir. Yeah, you are a Nazir. The Rush seemed to say this reflects the view of the Rabbanan, that as long as you accept one part of Nazir, so you've taken on the entire part. Fine. Case number 2, Rabbi say, is ultimately, again, I became a Nazir, and afterwards I say, oh, I didn't know that a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine. I didn't know that piece of information. Right? So Rabbi say, what's the halacha? Tanakama says, you're a Nazir. Rabbi Shimon says, you're not a Nazir. Logic. Tanakama says, once you accept part of Nazirus, you accept all of Nazirus. Rabbi Shimon says, no, you're only a Nazir once you accept all of Nazirus. Case 3, Rabbi say, is I become a Nazir fully cognizant of the halachos of Nazirus. But what was I banking on? A heter. Because I can't live without wine. Because my job is to bury the dead. So we'll say, what's the halacha in that case? The Chachamim say, you're not a Nazir. Rabbi Shimon says, you are a Nazir. Good, those are 3 cases. Let's analyze. So we'll say, the Gemara starts out by saying, it's interesting. Case number 1 in the Mishnah, which was, we'll say, remember again, the case where I say, I'm becoming a Nazir on the condition that I get to drink wine. So remember again, there was no machlokes in that case. Right? That case, it seems to be everyone agrees that what? That Allah Chamaisam a Nazir. But why not? Why doesn't Rabbi Shimon argue in that case, Rabbi say, right? Rabbi Shimon, what should Rabbi Shimon say in that case? That I'm not a Nazir. Why am I not a Nazir in that case? Because according to Rabbi Shimon, you only become a Nazir when? When you accept all facets of Nazirus. Well, in this case, I'm actively saying I'm only becoming a Nazir on the condition that I could drink wine. And therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon, such a Nazir shouldn't work. Why doesn't Rabbi Shimon argue on the first case of the Mishnah? This is incredible. Rabbi Shmuel Levi, Chaluk Hay Rabbi Shimon Aparesha. So Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, you're right. Again, very exciting, Chisrei Mechsura, so to speak. Right, there's something missing from the Mishnah, and Rabbi Shimon, in fact, argues even on the Reisha. Ravina says no. Ravina Bereisha lo palag Rabbi Shimon. My Taros is incredible. You know why? Mishum dahava le masna amasha kasov batora. So Rabbi say this is incredible. See, even Rabbi Shimon is going to agree. Rabbi say that case number one is a unique case. See, Rabbi say Rabbi Shimon will agree that if a person says, I hereby accept to become a Nazir and not eat grape skins. Right? So Rabbi Shimon will say, no. That's not enough. That's not enough. You have to actively accept everything. The case in the ratio will say something different. What's happening over here? A guy is saying, I'm becoming a Nazir on the condition that I get to drink wine. They will say that is called making a Tanai, which runs contrary to Torah law. What's the masna masha kasab Torah? And what's the halacha masna v'chala masna masha kasab Torah? What's the halacha? To know batal. They will say this is incredible. Whenever you make a Tanai condition which runs contrary to Torah law, they will say, how does halacha view that Tanai? How does it view that Tanai? It's batal. It doesn't exist. You can't. In other words, your ability, I will say, to legislate realities only operates within the reality as created by Torah law. But if you try to contradict Torah through your Tanai simply falls off. So therefore, again, Rabbi Shimon will say, I will say, when a person says, Harini Nazir, Amanas she'eshtiyai, I become a Nazir on the condition that I drink wine. So I will say, what do we hear when someone says that? What do we hear when a person makes that statement? What do we hear? All we hear is the first part of the statement, Harini Nazir. That's it. The second part of the statement is irrelevant. It's irrelevant. We don't hear anything. Because again, anytime you make a Tanai, which runs contrary to Torah law, the Tanai is void. So when a person says, Hareini Nazir, Amanas she'eshte falls off. That's like speaking gibberish. That's like saying, I'm a Nazir and I'm going to go to the supermarket today. Okay, go to the supermarket. Who cares? Right? In other words, the statement is irrelevant to the first part. All we hear is Hareini Nazir. Therefore, even Rabbi Shimon will agree that in a case like that, you become a full-fledged Nazir. Pretty incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. We'll say, by the way, there's an incredible Musar Haskell in this idea of what does it mean, that whenever you legislate, you make a Tanai which runs contrary to Torah law, the Tanai is batal. I will say, see, reality is defined not by how we see it. Reality is defined by how the Torah sees it. And this is an incredibly important yesod, because we spoke about this last night at Chassidus Chabura as well. We often look at reality as defined by what I see. What I see is reality, right? My truths are truth. My right is right? My morality is and that's not the way it works. As a Jew, my reality is created by the reality of Torah. My MS is created by the MS of Torah. My morality is created by the morality of Torah. And how do Chazal teach us that? That's why if I try to make a Tanai, which runs contrary to Torah law, it doesn't work. In other words, I will say, it's as if I've said nothing, because what am I trying to do? I'm trying to create an alternate reality. Well, you can't create an alternate reality to Torah, because I will say there is only the reality of Torah. There is no other reality that exists. It's such a profound yesod. And sometimes we don't realize it, consciously, subconsciously. We're often trying to create our own reality, our own parallel reality to Torah. Right? Torah says this, but, right? I have my hashkafas, I have my isms, I have my this, I have my that, whatever it might be. Because I was saying there's only one reality in life. And my whole job is to align my reality with Torah's reality, not to align Torah's reality with my reality. That's why if I make a Tanai, which runs contrary to Torah law, it doesn't exist. There's no construct like that in this world. There's only one source of MS. There's only one source of reality, and it's the reality and the MS of the Torah HaKadosh. It's such a beautiful idea. Rabbi Shimon Levi says, Amalecha. So Rabbi Shimon Levi will say, remember, Rabbi Shimon Levi said that, in fact, Rabbi Shimon even argues on the Reisha. He says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Amar Lecha, Hi Amanas ki chutz dami. He holds that anytime you say Amanas, it's as if you said chutz, except. So we'll say, so now remember again, so we'll say, let's take a step back. According to Rabbi Shimon, right, if you say Hareini Nazir, chutz min achartzanim, except, or say chutz min hayayin, except for wine. So we'll say, according to Rabbi Shimon, what's the halacha? So ultimately, again, you're not a Nazir. Why are you not a Nazir? Because you did not go ahead and include all of the prohibitions. I will say, so Rabbi Shmuel Levi says, Almanas, right, is the same thing as chutz. It's the same thing. Therefore, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi wants to suggest that Rabbi Shimon would argue even on the Reisha. I will say, I just want to point out, the Gemara is operating over here with two different models. The way the Mishnah is phrased is Harini Nazir al Minas. I will go ahead and become a Nazir on the condition that I am going to drink wine. On the condition that I'm going to drink wine. So we'll say, so here's the interesting shaila. Is that the same thing as saying, I'm a Nazir except for wine? So interestingly enough, Ravina wants to say, no, those are two different cases. When you say I'm a Nazir except for wine, what you're doing is you are excluding something, accepting everything else, right? So Rabbi Shimon would say in that case you're not a Nazir because you're actively not accepting something. But Ravina would say that's different than a case of almanas. Almanas means you're supposed to say, see, let me phrase it like this. What's your sin chutz and almanas? So say chutz means I recognize reality. I'm just choosing what? I recognize that Nazirus includes everything, but I don't want this. He'll say, what is almanas? Almanas is an attempt to create new realities. So he'll say, you can't create new realities. Only the Ribbon Shalom creates reality. Only Torah creates realities. So Ravina was operating under the idea that chutz and almanas are two different cases. Rabbi Shmuel Levi is saying, no, chutz and almanas is pretty much the same thing. And therefore Rabbi Shimon would disagree even in the first case of the Mishnah. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. Tanya Kavase Dravina is right test for Ravina. Amar Harini Nazir Amana Shehe Shose Yaim Mitam Lemesim. If a person says, I'm going to become a Nazir on the condition that I'm going to drink wine and become Tameh to the dead, Hare Ze Nazir Va'asr Bekulan. Guy is a Nazir, and ultimately Asr and everything. Why? Mipnei Shumasna Masha Kasabatora. V'chala Masna Masha Kasabatora. Tina'o batal. And then whoever tries to make a Tanai, which runs contrary to Torah law, his Tanai is batal. So therefore, I will say, it sounds like what's happening over here is that we've now resolved case number one of the Mishnah. Case number one of the Mishnah is a guy comes along and says, I am a Nazir on the condition that I get to drink wine, that I get to become Tameh to the dead. So essentially, I will say, what is the Mishnah saying? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You cannot create new realities which run contrary to Torah law. They'll say, and therefore what? And therefore Allah Lamaisa, therefore what? Your Tanai is batal, and ultimately again, you are a full-fledged Nazir. They'll say, and here's the principle. Kalamasna mashakasav batora tina'o batal. You go ahead and you make a Tanai which runs contrary to Torah law. Ultimately, again, your Tanai is batal. So we'll say, this is indeed how the Rambam paskins as well. So this is in Hilchos Nazirus, Parak Aleph Halach Yud Gimel. HaOmer, Hareini Nazir Amanas She'eyesh Shose Yainu V'Tamei L'Mesim, Omegaleach Sari. The Rambam has in more cases. I'm becoming a Nazir on the condition that I get to drink wine, on the condition that I get to become Tamei from Mesim, on the condition I get to cut my hair. What's the halacha? Hare Ze Nazir. Such a person is an active Nazir, va'asr b'kulam, and he's asr in all of these things. Why? Mipnei shehisna masha kasav b'torah, v'chala masna ala kasav b'torah tina'o batal. And we'll say again, if you make it right, you make a Tanai that runs contrary to Torah law, ultimately, again, your Tanai is batal. So we'll say that's how we paskin. I'll just point out also the interesting distinction sometimes between chutz and almanas. Almanas is an effort to create new realities, versus chutz, which is often just an attempt to free myself from certain obligations. See, I will say, we all do things wrong in life. So what's the most dangerous thing, right? If I'm going to do something, I will say, we're amongst friends, it's early, we should speak honestly and openly. If I'm going to do something wrong, right, which we're all going to do, what's the most important thing when you do something wrong? And don't say enjoy every moment of it, right? And you'll say, what's the most important thing of doing something wrong? Just owning it. So as long as I know, okay, this is wrong, for whatever the reason, I can't combat the desire to do it right now, so I'm going to do it. I'm probably even going to really enjoy it, right? Fine. I mean, not fine, but fine, because we're human beings. But just own it. Just own it. Just in other words, the worst thing you could do is rationalize it. So I always say, because once I begin to rationalize, I'm a human being and I do things wrong. But let me never lose sight of what I'm doing, that it's wrong. And maybe I'll be honest with myself that I'm going to keep doing this for a little while. Right? It's going to be a little, right? It's not yet Elul. I don't feel the need to really get it together. So I'm probably going to keep doing this for a little while. Okay, sometimes I will say we live with that level of inconsistency. As long as I'm cognizant of the fact that it's wrong. Then, fine. The challenge I will say is when it transforms into almanas. See, I will say, what's almanas? Almanas is an attempt to reshape reality. Right? Almanas is an attempt to take something which is wrong and suddenly institutionalize it, so to speak, for myself, and make it right. That's dangerous. That's dangerous. Because suddenly, again, everything becomes blurred. Right? A person wants to live in a state of sin, live in a state of sin. We're human beings. We all have periods of time like that. Just know it. That's a chutz life. A chutz life is when I know I can't do this. I'm not ready to take on this. I'm not ready to accept this. I'm not ready to change this. I'm not ready to behave like this. Okay, as long as you know, as long as I'm fully aware, it's wrong, but I'm not yet ready to change it. Almanas is when you try to take something that's inherently wrong and you try to make it right. Right? When you take something that's wrong and try to rationalize, this is okay, this is not a problem, it's archaic, it doesn't apply anymore, but all the different things that we do. Chazal say, we reject that straight out. Because the moment you try to make sheker emes, the moment you try to make tamei tahar, the moment you try to make wrong right, that's dangerous. That's the chilik between chutz and almanas. We'll say an incredible yisod. Make mistakes. Make plenty of mistakes in life. Go for it. Go for it. We all do, right? And it happens to all of us. As long as I'm fully cognizant that wrong is wrong and right is right. As long as I keep my head on straight, even while I'm doing things wrong, then ultimately it's almost assured that at some point in time, I'm going to turn myself around. Fall into the trap of almanas. There is an existential fear of disappearing into oblivion. The Gemara goes weiter. So what happens? So what was the next case? Next case was, I know, Yodea ani sheyesh nezirus. No, this is the last case, I'm sorry. This was, Yodea ani sheyesh asbiyayin. I know, right, so I took on nezirus. I know that a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine, but I was so sure that what? That I was going to get a heter because I can't live without wine. Okay, so the Gemara says so. Va'amrit reisha aser. So we'll say, but 1 second, what we said, right? Va'amrit reisha aser b'shimon matir. Now we'll say we're skipping out to case number 3, but in case number 2, remember again, what was case number 2? This was, I know that there is a concept of nazirus, but I did not know that a nazir is aser in wine. Okay, so we'll say, so what happened in this case? So Tanakama says you're a nazir. Rabbi Shimon says you're not a Nazir. Now again, logic being why? Because Rabbi Shimon says you need a full acceptance of Nazirus. Tanakh Rabbanan say no, you don't. In case number 3, I said I know that a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine, but I was sure that I was going to get a heter. In this case, ultimately Rabbi Shimon says it is an Ed Nazirus. Chacham say it's not an Ed Nazirus. So the Gemara is bothered by the seeming inconsistency between the respective opinions of Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. I have Amrit Reisha Asa, Rabbi Shimon Matir. But in case number 2, the Rabbanan said that you're Asa, Rabbi Shimon said you're Mutter. Nami Harei Zasar Shem Mate. So also the first part of the Gemara says is, you're right, switch around the opinions. Make the opinions consistent between cases 2 and 3. V'baisim, where the other possibility is, the Olam Lo Seifuch, in reality, don't switch around the opinions. Hasam, in that case, Hasam, Reisha, Kigon de Nazir Mechada. What's the case, Osai? The case could very well be, the first case could be, where the guy only actively undertook a neder nazirus for one item. The Nazir Mechada. So what happened? The Rabbanan the Army afilu lo Nazir elame achos men havi Nazir va'aser. So we'll say, so it could very well be that what happened, he only took on a neder nazirus to abstain from one thing. Well, now let's go back. So according to the Rabbanan, Rabbi say that's absolutely fine, because the Rabbanan are of the opinion that Allah might say even if you only take a neder nazirus to abstain from one thing, you're a full-fledged Nazir. The Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon will say 3 lines down from the top, Yud Aleph from base 11b. But Rabbi Shimon, the Amar Achi Yazim Mikulam Mutter. But according to Rabbi Shimon, ultimately, Rabbi say, remember again, this is the Shitas Rabbi Shimon. We've seen this already for a while. Shitas Rabbi Shimon is that Allah Lamaisa, you only become a Nazir when you agree to abstain from everything. That's the Reisha. Therefore, again, so because in the first case, which is really case number 2, right? In case number 2, we're talking about a guy who only agreed to abstain from one thing. According to the Rabbanon, he's going to be a Nazir, right? And ultimately, again, according to Rabbi Shimon, he's not going to be a Nazir. Seifa, the last case in the Mishnah, is the Nazir Mikulhu. It will say is where you became a full-fledged Nazir. Now, what happens? V'itshal mechada. And I will say, what are you attempting to do? Remember again, in case number 3, I will say, what's the case? I'm a Nazir, already Nazir, and I knew what a neder nazirus entails. I will say, what am I trying to do now? What am I trying to do? Now, I'm trying to go ahead and have hatara, right, on wine or on tumas meis. So I know what I got into. I'm now trying to get out of something. V'itshal mechada. So I want hatara on one of the parts of Naziros. So according to the Rabbanon who say, the Rabbanon say that when making a neder Nazirus, even if you just go ahead and what? Accept one part of Nazirus, what's happened? You have accepted the whole. So too, ki mitshal mechada minayu ishtri. So it's very interesting. According to the Rabbanon, as soon as you request hatara on one part or gain hatara on one part, they will say, what happens? You have hatara on the whole thing. Now, I will say, I want to point out, we have not spoken about this topic yet, about hatara of a neder nazirus. Right? We have not encountered, we've referenced it, but we have not actually delved into this. So we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves in this, but the Rabbanon are essentially saying the same way that you could undertake neder nazirus with a partial acceptance, and partial acceptance gives you the whole neder. So the Rabbanan wanted to suggest that partial revocation could also undo the neder in its entirety. And that's why when the guy says, I became a Nazir, but I thought I was going to get a heter, and he appeals for a heter, and maybe even he gets a heter, ultimately, again, a heter for wine goes ahead and undoes the entire neder nazir. So Rabbi Shimon, now again, I'm not suggesting that's the halacha l'maisa, but it's what's being floated over here. The Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that you only become a Nazir when you undertake the Nazir in its entirety, ki mitshal nami me'ahu ad mitshal mikulhu. So too, again, when it comes to revoking the neder is only revoked if there's a complete revocation. But let's say partial revocation, let's say, for example, from wine, is not going to fundamentally undermine the neder. Mishum hachi katani, Rabbi Shimon Oser. That's what I was saying. Case number three, the Rabbanon are going to say that the neder is mutter, right? Because Rabbanon will say partial revocation results in complete revocation. Rabbi Shimon will say the same way you have to undertake a neder nazirus in its entirety in order to go ahead and revoke the neder nazirus. It has to be revoked in its entirety as well. Okay, fine. That's one explanation. You might say the other possibility is, it's very interesting. Benidre onsin kamiflagi. This is fascinating. Perhaps I will say their machlokes is about Nidre onsin. I will say this is very exciting, a little bit of a blast from the past. We are going back now for a little bit of a chazara for Maseches Nedarim. Very exciting. So I'll say maybe this is a case of Nidre onsin. I will say we'll talk about all of these Nedarim in just a moment. Uplugta to Shmuel Rabbi Asi. Here we go. And this machlokes is Shmuel Asi. What happened? Arba Nedarim hitir chachamim. We'll say there are 4 different types of Nedarim that Chazal said are mutter. Rabbi will say, when we say mutter, what does mutter mean in this context? Mutter means ultimately, again, that they're not really binding nidarim. Rabbi will say, what are the 4 examples? Here we go. Nidre zeruzin, nidre havai, nidre shkagos, benidre onsin. So we'll say, take a look at the rush for just a moment. This is very exciting because we have a little bit of a chazar over here. So we'll say, if you look in the rush, about 15 lines in, right-hand column, Dalid nidarim hitiru chachamim nidre zeruzim, befarish hasam. So let's remember again, what's nidre zeruzim? Remember this case? Hayamocher chayfetz, va'amer konam she'eni poches l'cha minasela, va'ala omer konim she'eni mosif l'cha ala shekel. Let's remember this case. This was nidre zeruzim. Nidre zeruzim is when you go ahead and make a neder in order to get someone else to do something. So I'm selling an object. Ruvain shows up in the store. I make a neder, Ruvain, I'm not selling this for less than $1,000. Right? Ruvain says, I'm not buying it for less than for more than $600. Now we'll say, what's my intention when I make this neder? What's my intention? Right? I want Ruvain to go no lower than 800. Right? What's Ruvain's intention when he goes ahead and he makes his neder? He's going no higher than 800. The point over here is they're making nedarim not for the sake of making binding nedarim, but they're posturing in order to go ahead and get the best price. So we'll say this is called nidre zeruzin. Ultimately, again, and therefore this is not a binding neder because it's clear what their motivation is. What's the next case? Nidre shkagos. Look at the rush again. Kigon konam imachalti b'shasisi. We'll say, here's the case. A person says, this loaf of bread should be konam to me if I ate and drank today. And I will say, I thought that I didn't eat and drink today. That's why I made the neder. Right? This bread should be konam to me if I ate and drank today. When I made the neder, I was positive that I didn't eat or drink. Right? So, and therefore, I'm just making a statement that the loaf is going to remain mutter. Then what happens after I make the neder? Someone reminds me, oh, how was that cup of coffee this morning? Right? So I will say that's called nidre shkagos. So once again, when I made the neder, I had mistaken intent. Therefore, the halacha is, ultimately, again, it's not binding. And nidre havai. We'll say nidre havai are exaggerated nidarim, right? This loaf of bread should be konam to me if I saw 1 million people on 7 Mile Lane today. Okay, so as I said, that's obviously, again, complete exaggeration. And the last category in the rush, nidre onsim hidiru chaver sheyochal etzlo b'chalohu o shechala b'no o shek b'no. So I said, this is where halacha l'maisa, I make a neder that I'm going to eat at Ruvain's house, or Ruvain makes a neder obligating me to eat at his house, or otherwise I'm not allowed to benefit from his property. And what happens? I get stuck at the other side of the swollen river, or I'm stuck in traffic. So there's an extenuating circumstance that's going ahead and preventing me from actualizing the terms of the neder. So we'll say so let's go back to the Gemara. This nan. Arba nedarim hitiru chachamim. There are 4 types of nedarim that Chazal said are mutter, even without going through the process of revocation. And what are they? Nidre zeruzin, nidre havai, nidre shkagos, nidre osin. So a good Chazal are these 4 categories of nedarim. But Amr Rabbi Yehuda Amarav Asi, Arba nedarim halalu tzrichin she'ela chachamim. Now listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav Asi, these 4 nedarim in fact require she'ela. They do require hatara from a chacham. 1 second. So Shmuel said, what are you talking about? Look at the lashon over here. The whole lashon will say these types of nadarim hitiru chachamim. They will say, what does hitiru chachamim mean? They're mutter without going through the process of she'ela. And now Shmuel says to Rabbi Yehuda, Shmuel says to Rav Asi, what are you talking about? Or Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, who said in Rav Asi, how can you say they require she'ela when the Gemara itself says that they are mutter on their own? Shmuel said, what do you see from here? They will say, let's zero in a little bit. Why is this relevant to our case? This is relevant to our case because the case number 3 in the Mishnah would fall under the umbrella of nidre shogigin. Nidre shogigin. We'll say, what's case number 3 in the Mishnah? Case number 3 in the Mishnah is, guy says, I became a Nazir, and I'm fully cognizant of all the details. But, what's the but? I will say, what's the but? I thought for sure I could get a heter for wine because I need wine. So he made a mistake in his neder. Shabbos says, now what's the shaila? What's the shaila? Does he need to undergo a process of revocation or not? Shabbos says, now watch this. So therefore the Chachamim says, Rabbanan Savri Kishmuel. The Rabbanan in the Mishnah hold like Shmuel. Shabbos say, what does Shmuel hold? Nidre Shogigin. What happens if you make a neder b'shogig? What happens to that neder? What happens to that neder? It's mutter. Mutter how? It just is mutter. In other words, it doesn't require any type of process of revocation or annulment. It's simply mutter. That's why the Rabbanan and the Mishnah say, okay, you clearly made a mistake in neder, and therefore, again, there's no nazirus. Conversely, Rabbi Shimon holds like Ravasi. What does Ravasi hold? Ravasi holds that nidre shogigin still require you to go to a chacham for she'ela, for hatara. And therefore, in the Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon is going to say that halacha lamaisa, this case, you can get out of your neder nazirus, but what? But what? You absolutely have to go to a chacham for the process of revocation. Shabbos say, so how do we go ahead and paskin? Shabbos say, so this is the Rambam, and he writes over here in Halach Perak Aleph Halacha Tesvav. Here we go. Amar Yodea Yisi Shar Nazir Asa B'Choleila. Here's the case. Shabbos say, I know that a Nazir is not allowed to do all of these things. I know. Shabbos says, this is case number 3 in the Mishnah. I know that a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine. All these things. But I assumed that it was going to be mutter for me to go ahead and drink wine. Why? Because I can't live without wine. I will say, by the way, you can see, let's say the guy says, my profession is I'm a sommelier, right? This is what I do. Same case in the grave digger, right? I thought for sure I'd be able to become Tamei Tumas Mason, because ultimately, again, that's what I do for a living. So what do you do in this case? We'll say, how do we paskin? The Rambam writes, Hare ze eno nazir. We paskin in this case, Rabbosai, the guy is not a nazir. Why? Here we go. Here it is. Because Rabbosai, this is the Rambam paskins. This is considered to be a nidre shkagos, a mistaken neder. And I will say, how do we paskin when it comes to a mistaken neder? We paskin ultimately again like Shmuel, namely that halacha l'maisa such a neder falls off by itself without having to undergo any specific mechanism of she'ela. So Rabbi say, fast says case number 3. Fascinating case, halacha l'maisa, we pass like Shmuel, you become a Nazir, and again, I know all the isurim, but again, I was so sure that I would have an out for wine because I can't live without wine, I can't live without burying the dead. Halacha l'maisa nidre shkagas, totally mutter, you're not a Nazir. Incredible. But let's go back to Mishnah. Harini Nazir va'alai legaleach. So what's an interesting case? I'm a Nazir, and I take it upon myself to shave. Now we'll say, now that's what it literally means, va'alai legaleach. Now we'll say, the truth is what we're going to see, what that statement really means is that there's 2 things happening over here. Part 1 of my statement is, I'm a Nazir. Va'alai legaleach means, and I'm also undertaking upon myself the obligation to provide the karbanos for another person's neder nazirus as well. So we'll say it's the sponsor a Nazir program. In other words, that like I'm a Nazir and I'm sponsoring another Nazir, right? So if you look at Rashi says I'm a Harini Nazir ba'alai legaleach Nazir v'ani bimkomo shel Nazir acher lahavi karbonosa biyom tag lachaso. So again, 2 statements I'm making. A, Harini Nazir, that's part 1, I'm becoming a Nazir. Va'alai legaleach. Nazir. And it's upon us, it literally means I'm going to shave a Nazir, which of course doesn't literally mean that, but rather it means I take upon myself to provide the karbanos for another Nazir when he finishes his neder naziros. What happens? Shama Chavero, I will say, I make this statement. My friend hears me, he becomes inspired, and what does he say? Shama Chavero va'amar va'ani va'alai legaleach Nazir. So my friend hears me, he says, va'ani, me too. And upon me, ultimately, again, is obligated to provide karbanos for a Nazir. So Rabbi says, what's the halacha? So now he's obligated as well. Rabbi says, what is he obligated in? 2 things, right? Number 1, he's also become a Nazir. And number 2, he's also agreed to provide the karbanos for a Nazir at the end of his Nazirite vow. So the Mishnah says, by the way, how you pick him, Rabbi says, if these guys are smart, right? If these 2 guys are smart, we'll call them Reuben and Shimon. Reuben, the original vower. Shimon, the Va'ani guy, if they're smart, Megalchim Zeh. If they're smart, what could they do? They could each satisfy their obligation by providing their karbanos for the other, right? Reuven said, I'm a Nazir, Hareini Nazir va'alai legayach Nazir. So I'm a Nazir, and I'm also going to provide karbanos for a Nazir. Shimon hears this. He says, Va'ani, me too. Va'alai legayach Nazir. I'm also going to provide karbanos. So the Mishnah says, if they're smart, no problem. Reuven could fulfill his obligation how? By providing karbanos for Shimon. Shimon could fulfill his vow how? By providing karbanos for Reuven. And beautiful. This way, again, no one's out anything. V'imlav, if they're not smart, or if they're not picking, then they can fulfill their obligations through other people as well. Meaning that, and again, Reuven can provide karbanos for Zvulun, and Shimon could provide, karbanos for Levi. They can each provide for different Nazirim. Says the Gemara, Ibarilahu. Well, let's do a few more minutes. Ibarilahu. Shema Chavero va'amar va'ani mahu. So this is very interesting. So the way the Mishnah is set up is, remember, you've got Reuven. Reuven's coming along, and what is Reuven saying? Hareini Nazir, I am a Nazir, va'alai legaleach Nazir. And I also undertake the obligation to provide karbanos for another Nazir. Shimon goes ahead, and I will say in the Mishnah, Shimon says, va'ani, me too, va'alai legaleach Nazir. And I'm also going to go ahead and provide the karbanos. What happens, says the Gemara, if Shimon just says, va'ani, Shimon doesn't say, va'ani, va'alai legaleach Nazir. He just says, va'ani, me too. What happens if he just says, me too? What level of obligation does that generate? So, va'ani akule diburi mashma, does va'ani go on the whole statement, and therefore Shimon becomes obligated, A, in an ed and a zeros, and also what? To provide karbanos for another Nazir. In other words, does va'ani mean, I'm in? Shimon says, va'ani, me too. For everything you said, Odilma, apagi diburi mashma, or maybe no, va'ani just means for part of the statement. In other words, maybe va'ani is Shimon just saying what? I'll become a Nazir, right? Or part of the statement. The Gemara says, Intim salom apagi diburi mashma, areisha aseifa. And if you say va'ani only works for part of the statement, then I will say, what's the shaila? Which part of the statement? Does it work to become a Nazir, or does it work ultimately again to provide karbanos for another Nazir? We'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach. Incredible. And I'm leaving you a little bit on a cliffhanger. Sorry about that. All right, Chevra on Zoom, have a wonderful day, everyone. A good Shabbos, a good Erev Shabbos. Shkoyach for another very beautiful week.